For decades, Guy Motors was one of Britain's most respected vehicle manufacturers. Its trucks and buses were used across the UK and exported around the world. From city streets to construction sites, Guy vehicles played a major role in Britain's transport network. At its peak, the company was a key part of the British automotive industry. Yet today, the name Guy Motors has almost completely disappeared. So what happened? The story of Guy Motors is one of innovation, success, and eventually decline as the British truck industry changed forever. Sidney S. Guy entered the world on April 2nd, 1885 in Wolverhampton, a city where industry shaped every street and household. His father, Thomas, managed teams at the railway carriage works, and Sidney grew up surrounded by the discipline and noise of heavy engineering. After elementary school, he enrolled at Wolverhampton Municipal Technical School, focusing on mechanical engineering and metallurgy. An apprenticeship at Johnson's & Company from 1902 to 1906 immersed him in engine fitting and boiler design. But it was the promise of internal combustion that truly captured his imagination. By the early 19-teens, Sidney was a fixture at the Wolverhampton Engineers Club, where debates about motor transport and chassis design filled the evenings. These gatherings connected him with local engineers and business owners, relationships that would soon prove vital. In 1914, Sidney and his brother William pooled their savings to launch Guy Motors Limited. They set up shop in a converted textile mill on Compton Road, drawn by its central location and flexible workspace. Sidney's ambitions were clear from the start. He raised £15,000 in capital, combining his own funds, a local bank loan, and investments from Wolverhampton's industrial community. Inspired by a 1913 visit to Ford's Highland Park plant in Detroit, he organised the factory with assembly line ideas, scaled for a small but skilled team and a varied product line. The first Guy automobile, a 12-horsepower four-cylinder car, emerged from the Compton Road workshop in late 1914. Its cast-iron engine block and detachable aluminium cylinder head reflected Sidney's focus on durability and weight savings. Marketed as a practical town car, it found early buyers, but the outbreak of World War I soon shifted the company's direction. The Ministry of Munitions contracted Guy Motors to build light trucks for the army, anchoring the firm's commercial future. Sidney recruited engineers and apprentices from his own network, building a team united by a belief in practical innovation. Long hours and tight budgets defined those early days, but the blend of technical skill and local support set Guy Motors on a path toward Britain's transport revolution. By the early 1920s, Guy Motors had become a byword for practical engineering in Britain's growing commercial vehicle market. Sidney Guy's approach was never to simply keep pace with his rivals. He pushed for technical advances that set the company apart. In 1918, his patent GB 177,322 introduced an underslung chassis with semi-elliptic leaf spring suspension, a design that allowed heavier loads without sacrificing ride quality. The following years saw further patents, including a self-shifting gearbox and a cooling system with a perforated crankcase liner to extend engine life, innovations that quickly filtered into Guy's trucks and buses. Inside the Compton Road Works, a workforce of 150 men rotated between assembly, engine fitting and finishing. This skill rotation policy, rare for its time, meant every worker understood the entire vehicle, not just a single bolt or bracket. The result was flexibility on the shop floor and a sense of shared responsibility for the finished product. Trade journals of the era took notice. In 1923, a review in Commercial Motor praised Guy's robust 3-speed gearbox and noted that municipal operators reported lower maintenance costs compared to competitors. The engineering team drew talent from across the Midlands, including John W. Wrigley, who led the design of the first Guy bus chassis in 1919. Margaret Hall, one of Britain's first female draftswomen in the motor industry, produced the precision drawings for the new gearbox. Her blueprints still survive in the Wolverhampton archives. Together, these engineers built vehicles that could withstand the pounding of cobbled city streets and the demands of long-distance hauling. Guy Motors didn't just sell machines, they offered on-site maintenance training, a practice almost unheard of in the 1920s. Operators from Leeds to Birmingham came to trust the brand for vehicles that lasted. sometimes logging over 200,000 miles before overhaul. By the end of the decade, Guy's reputation for durability and innovation was firmly established, setting the stage for the company's rapid expansion as Britain approached another era of crisis. By the late 1930s, the quiet hum of Guy Motors' Compton Road works had become a roar. War was no longer a distant threat. It was a reality that demanded every ounce of industrial strength Britain could muster. The Ministry of Supply took control of the factory, halting civilian production overnight and redirecting every press and bench to military contracts. Engineers and toolmakers who once debated gear ratios now worked under blackout conditions, assembling trucks and carriers for the war effort. The numbers tell the scale. Between 1940 and 1944, Guy Motors delivered 12,000 military vehicles, an output that dwarfed anything in the company's history. The workforce swelled to 3,200 by 1944, triple its pre-war size. Rows of new presses lined the factory floor, stamping out chassis for the Guy Hunchback and Bren Carrier lorries. The air inside was thick with the clang of metal and the urgency of deadlines that came not from salesmen, but from the War Office. For many in Wolverhampton, the war opened doors that had always been closed. Hundreds of women, recruited under the Women's Auxiliary Service, took up roles as welders, machinists and inspectors. Their hands shaped everything from truck axles to aircraft fuselage sections for the Vickers Wellington. Wartime records show that Guy's metalworking shops turned out thousands of these components, pushing the limits of what the plant had ever attempted. The company's engineering notebooks from those years are filled with sketches for jigs, fixtures and production shortcuts. Evidence of a workforce improvising under pressure but never losing sight of quality. The plant ran day and night. Foremen clocked 12-hour shifts and apprentices learned their trades by torchlight. Every truck that rolled out was destined for the front lines, carrying supplies across North Africa, Italy and beyond. The skills, presses and experience gained during these years would become the backbone of Guy's post-war civilian production. But in the moment, survival meant keeping pace with the relentless demands of war. The transformation was total, a company remade by necessity, its name now synonymous with Britain's industrial resolve. The close of World War II brought a new kind of demand to the doors of Guy Motors. Britain's battered cities needed reliable buses to reconnect neighbourhoods, move workers, and power a national recovery. In this climate, the Guy Arab bus became a familiar sight from Glasgow to the Midlands. Its reputation for toughness and simple maintenance made it the backbone of municipal fleets, but the real story was in the numbers. Between 1933 and 1972, nearly 6,500 Arab chassis left the Wolverhampton works, a figure that placed Guy among Britain's leading bus builders. The Arab's engineering was both practical and forward-thinking. Post-war models featured an underfloor diesel layout, a design that lowered the centre of gravity and freed up space for passengers. Operators favoured the Gardner 5LW and 6LW engines, known for their fuel efficiency and long service intervals. The dropped-frame chassis paired with leaf spring suspension meant that buses could handle rough city streets and rural roads with equal confidence. Municipal buyers found these traits irresistible. Birmingham, London and the Scottish Bus Group all placed major orders, drawn by the promise of low running costs and vehicles that could stay on the road for decades. Guy's buses also travelled far beyond Britain's borders. Orders from Kenya, South Africa and Hong Kong brought the Arab to some of the world's most challenging climates. In Hong Kong, the robust chassis and reliable Gardner engines proved their worth on twisting mountain routes and in tropical heat. By 1950, Guy Motors reported annual sales of £5.3 million, a figure driven by both domestic contracts and a steady stream of export orders. The company's export reach became a point of pride, with Guy buses earning a reputation for outlasting rivals in places where spare parts were scarce and maintenance expertise was limited. At its post-war peak, Guy Motors stood as a symbol of British engineering at its most practical and effective. The Arab bus, with its distinctive radiator and solid stance, became a fixture of daily life for millions. This period of prosperity would soon give way to new challenges. But for a time, Guy Motors was at the very heart of a nation rebuilding itself, one bus route at a time. The partnership with Jaguar in 1954 arrived as both a compliment and a challenge for Guy Motors. Jaguar's directors, eager to expand production of the new Mark II sedan, turned to Guy's Compton Road Works for their reputation in chassis engineering. The deal required Guy to retool its factory for passenger car standards, a world apart from the rugged tolerances of bus and lorry frames. £2.3 million were invested in new jigs, presses, and a state-of-the-art paint shop, all designed to meet the high-precision demands of Jaguar's Coventry team. 20 specialist engineers relocated to Wolverhampton, bringing with them a different culture of quality control and a relentless focus on finish. Between 1954 and 1957, Guy turned out several thousand Mark II chassis, each one destined for Jaguar's booming export market. The project brought a short-lived sense of pride and technical achievement to the shop floor. Board minutes from the period reflect a hope that this diversification would secure Guy's future, providing steady cash flow and a foothold in the lucrative passenger car sector. But the financial strain soon became clear. The cost of tooling up for Jaguar's standards far exceeded the original estimates, and the margins on each chassis were slimmer than anticipated. The press shop, once optimised for robust truck frames, now struggled with the delicate tolerances required for luxury cars. When Jaguar shifted production back to Coventry in 1957, Guy was left with specialised equipment and a payroll swollen by new hires. The anticipated stability never materialised. Instead, the venture exposed the company to new risks, draining capital and leaving it more vulnerable than before. By reaching for a share of the high-performance car market, Guy Motors found itself stretched thin, its independence quietly eroding, even as the factory still echoed with the sounds of production. By April 1961, the independence that once defined Guy Motors was gone. Leyland Motors acquired a 51% controlling stake, injecting £3.1 million, and sweeping through the boardroom with a new set of priorities. The takeover was not just about ownership, it was about control. Leyland's directors, led by Sir William Lyons, arrived in Wolverhampton with a mandate to streamline and rationalise. Guy's legacy of innovation and local pride now faced the realities of a national conglomerate focused on efficiency and market share. Production lines that had once run with a sense of local stewardship now answered to distant corporate planners. Leyland's strategy was clear: eliminate duplication, consolidate models, and redirect resources to their World Master range. The B-Series lorry, a staple of Guy's post-war recovery, was cancelled almost overnight. The Compton Road plant, once a symbol of resilience, was partially converted for bus bodywork, its future as a truck factory in doubt. The impact on the workforce was immediate and severe. In 1960, Guy employed 2,200 people. By 1962, that number had dropped to just 1,600. Redundancy notices arrived in batches, and the once busy canteens grew quiet. For many families in Wolverhampton, the loss was personal. Generations who had built their lives around the rhythms of the factory now faced an uncertain future. Inside the plant, the atmosphere shifted. Decisions about new models and investments were made not in Wolverhampton, but in Leyland's headquarters. The sense of autonomy that had defined Guy Motors for nearly 5 decades faded. The company was now a subsidiary, its fate tied to the broader ambitions and pressures of Leyland's sprawling empire. The end of independence was not just a change in management. It was the beginning of a new era, one where Guy's future would be shaped by forces far beyond its own walls. By the mid-1960s, the British commercial vehicle market was no longer a protected stronghold. Continental manufacturers, Volvo, Scania and Mercedes-Benz, arrived with trucks and buses that offered not just reliability but easier servicing and modern comforts. Fleet operators, pressed by shrinking budgets and rising expectations, began to look elsewhere. Guy Motors, once a byword for rugged engineering, now faced a new kind of competition, one that demanded not just durability but innovation that worked in the real world. In this climate, Guy's management gambled on a bold departure: the Wulfrunian double-decker. Conceived as a leap ahead of British rivals, it packed features that were rare for its time: air suspension, independent front axles, power steering and a low-floor rear entrance. The design promised easier boarding and a smoother ride, but it came at a steep price. Only 27 Wulfrunians were ever built, all for Midland Red and a handful of overseas buyers. Each vehicle cost £12,500, a figure that dwarfed the price of established models. The real cost, though, came in the workshop. The Wulfrunian's air bellows suspension leaked persistently and operators reported maintenance demands of 45 hours per 1,000 kilometres, nearly double that of conventional buses. Rear-mounted engines overheated on city routes, and the bespoke gearbox lacking a proper torque converter wore out long before its time. Spare parts became a headache as the model shared little with Guy's older lines or with standard Gardner components. Operators grew frustrated. Breakdowns were frequent and workshop staff struggled to keep the new systems running. Many Wulfrunians were withdrawn after just a few years, some scrapped before reaching 100,000 miles. For Guy Motors, the Wulfrunian was meant to be a showcase of innovation, but it quickly became a cautionary tale. As foreign rivals expanded their share of the British market, Guy's reputation, built over decades, was eroded by a single failed experiment. In December 1967, the workforce at Compton Road gathered to hear the news. Leyland's directors had posted the closure notice. Guy Motors would cease production in the spring. The announcement landed hard in Wolverhampton, where generations had clocked in and out beneath the Guy name. By March 1968, the final vehicle, a Guy-branded chassis, rolled off the line. After 54 years, the rhythmic noise of presses and welders faded, replaced by silence and the uncertainty of what would come next. Yet the end of production did not erase the company's imprint. In the months that followed, former employees and local enthusiasts began collecting documents, blueprints, and surviving vehicles. Some buses and lorries, too rugged for the scrapyard, found new life in the hands of collectors. The British Commercial Vehicle Museum in Leyland and the Coventry Transport Museum both acquired Guy-built machines, preserving them as working examples of British engineering. Accession logs from the late 1960s note the arrival of a 1948 Guy Arab double-decker and a rare Wulfrunian, each restored to running order by volunteers who remembered the old factory's methods. Enthusiast groups formed across the country, organising rallies and restoring vehicles in home garages. In Wolverhampton, retired fitters and machinists met to share stories and swap spare parts. For them, a Guy badge on a radiator was more than a memory. It was proof of a community's skill and pride. Though the company's name faded from new registrations, its legacy endured, pieced together by those determined to keep its history alive. Today, Guy Motors survives only in fading emblems and collectors' archives, a silent testament to how quickly industrial giants can vanish when innovation stalls and global competition intensifies. Its story mirrors the fate of much of British manufacturing, proud, ambitious, and ultimately swept away by forces beyond its control. The lesson endures. No legacy is immune to time or change. What do you think? Could a company like Guy ever rise again?